Verna Tillett refilled coffee cups for a living, and by the second week of October, the whole of Halden Falls, Ohio was laughing at her. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't made a scene. She had circled one line on Rex Callender's glossy contract with a stub of pencil, and she had said the word swindle out loud, once, in a quiet voice, at the Bluebird counter. Then she set the coffee pot down, and she pointed at page 9. At the town hall supper, with the tables pushed together and the whole street packed in, the developer smiled at her the way a grown man smiles at a child. "Sweetheart," he said, "when you've closed as many deals as I have, come find me. Until then, keep the coffee hot." 40-odd neighbors laughed. Each of them had $2,400 riding on the man. What none of them remembered was this. 14 years, Verna had worked the county Register of Deeds counter before they cut her job. She knew exactly what a real bond looked like. And this was not one. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, do an old clerk a kindness. Subscribe to the channel, and in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I like to know where these stories travel. Now, let me take you back to the fall of 1971, to a mill town that was already starting to lose its shine. Halden Falls sat in a bend of the Muskegon River, in the flat green middle of Ohio. It had a paper mill on the north end and a main street on the south, and for most of a century the mill had fed the street. That fall, the mill was running 4 days a week instead of 6. You could feel it before anyone said it. You could feel it in the way men lingered over a single cup of coffee. You could feel it in the storefronts. The 5 and Dime had brown paper in half its windows. The shoe repair had closed in June. The Rialto still lit its marquee on Fridays, but it showed pictures 2 years old. The Bluebird Diner sat on the corner of Main and 2nd, and it did not close. It had a neon sign shaped like a bird, and the bird's wing flickered when the wind came off the river, and Marion Deal had been meaning to fix it for 11 years. Inside, it was warm. The counter was formica, the color of butter, and the stools were red, and the booths along the window were red, and the coffee was always on. Marion cooked. Verna carried the plates. She was 58 that autumn. She was wide through the shoulders and steady on her feet, and she wore her gray hair pinned back off a plain, tired face. She'd been pretty once, in the way that hard-working women are pretty, and she was handsome still, though she'd have laughed at the word. She kept her apron pockets full. Order pad. 2 pencils. A roll of nickels for the register when Marion ran short. And, folded in a soft cloth, her late husband's reading glasses. Earl had worn them for 30 years to read the racing form and the scripture, in about equal measure, and he'd been gone 4 winters now, and she took them out a dozen times a day without thinking. They were the only fine thing she owned. Verna remembered land. That was the thing about her the town had forgotten. For 14 years she'd stood behind the counter at the Register of Deeds, up at the county seat in Bergen, and she'd handled every deed, every lien, every plat and easement and quitclaim that passed through Marl County. She could tell you the lot number of the Hendricks farm without looking. She could tell you which parcels on the West Road had the old mineral rights carved out and which didn't. When the county consolidated 3 offices into one in 1969 to save money, they kept the young man with the accounting certificate and they let Verna go. 14 years, and a handshake, and a card signed by 6 people. She'd come home to Halden Falls, and Marion had given her a job the same afternoon, because that is the kind of man Marion Deal is. There was a story about Verna from the old days, and it was true, though hardly anybody told it anymore. Back in 1963, a widow named Cora Bell had nearly lost her farm. There was a lien filed against it, a big one, for a debt the county said her late husband had owed. Cora came to the counter crying, ready to sign the place away to settle it. And Verna, going through the record book by hand, found the thing. The lien had been filed against the wrong parcel. A clerk 2 counties over had transposed 2 numbers in the legal description. The debt belonged to a different farm entirely, 40 miles east. Verna pulled the original entry, matched it to the plat, and wrote it all out in a clean hand. And Cora Bell kept her land and her cattle and died in her own bed 11 years later. That was Verna. She read the small print. She always had. But 1963 was a long time ago, and a town that is frightened about its future doesn't want to remember that its waitress used to be somebody. It wants to be told that everything is going to be fine, which is exactly what Rex Callender came to town to tell them. He arrived on a Tuesday in a cream-colored Lincoln Continental, and the car alone stopped traffic on Main. It was long and pale and clean as an egg, and it pulled up in front of the town hall like something out of a magazine. Callender got out in a camel coat and shook every hand he could reach. He was maybe 50, tanned in October, with silver hair combed straight back and a smile that never seemed to cost him anything. He had a young man with him who carried the cases, and in the cases was the model. They set it up in the town hall lobby on a folding table, under the good lights, and by supper time half the town had filed past it. It was a scale model of Main Street. Only it wasn't Main Street as it was. It was Main Street reborn. Tiny buildings, freshly painted, with little awnings and little trees along the curb. And where the old rail yard sat rusting behind the mill, there was a shopping plaza, white and modern, with a department store and a grocery and a wide lot full of little parked cars. There was even a fountain. Callender called it New Halden. He said it soft, like a promise. New Halden. This town has good bones, he told the crowd. He had a way of talking that made you feel he'd chosen you personally. The mill won't carry you forever. Everybody in this room knows that, and nobody's had the nerve to say it. So, I'll say it. You need something new, and I'm here to build it with you. Not for you. With you. The company was called Keystone Renewal Trust. It was, he explained, a private firm that partnered with proud small towns to do what the towns couldn't do alone. And here was the beautiful part. The town wouldn't be beholden to any bank in Columbus. The town would fund it themselves, and the town would profit from it themselves. He called them municipal renewal bonds. You put in $2,400. In 90 days, at maturity, you got your $2,400 back, plus a share of the plaza's first-year earnings. A year's savings, for most families in that room, turned around in 3 months with fruit on it. And you'd own a piece of the thing that saved your town. You have to understand what $2,400 was in Halden Falls in 1971. It was the roof fund. It was the burial money. It was the envelope in the coffee can that a family had built up nickel by nickel across a decade of 4-day weeks. It was everything. And Callender was asking them to hand it over and telling them they'd be fools not to. The line to sign started that first night. Verna watched it all from behind her counter, because the town hall lobby was across the street and the Bluebird's window looked right at it. She watched the Lincoln. She watched the coats going in and the smiles coming out. She didn't say much. Marion asked her what she made of it, and she said only, "I'd want to read it first." Her chance came on the Thursday. Callender came into the Bluebird for lunch, him and his young man, and they took the big corner booth, and Verna served them. He was pleasant to her. He was pleasant to everybody. He had the meatloaf, and afterward he had a slice of Marion's apple pie, and he told her it was the best pie he'd had east of the Mississippi, and he meant it about as much as he meant anything. There was a folder on the table beside his elbow, his sample contract. He'd been showing it around all morning. Verna refilled his coffee. And then she said, "Easy as anything. Mr. Callender, would you mind if I had a look at that?" Just an old habit of mine. I used to work in an office with a lot of paper." He slid it across without a thought. Why would he think anything of it? She was the waitress. She was pouring his coffee. He went back to talking to his young man about square footage. Verna took Earl's glasses out of her apron. She unfolded the cloth. She put them on. And she stood there at the end of the booth, by the pie case, and she read. She read the way she used to read at the counter in Bergen. Which is to say, she read every word, and she read from the back forward as well as the front. Most people read a contract from the top, get tired around the good part, and sign. Verna read the definitions. She read the schedules. She read the fine gray type on the last leaves where the real language always hides. And on page 9, she went still. It was 3 things, and they sat together like a nest of snakes. First, the escrow. The contract said the deposit money would be held in escrow, held safe, in other words, by a neutral third party, by a firm called Cornerstone Fiduciary Services. Verna read it twice. Cornerstone Fiduciary Services. Then she went back to the front, to the fine print under the letterhead, where the parent company was named, Keystone Renewal Trust and its wholly owned subsidiaries. Cornerstone Fiduciary was Keystone's own company. Callender owned the vault he was promising to lock your money inside. There was no neutral party. There was only him, holding the coffee can with both hands. Second, the redemption. She'd been told. Everyone had been told. 2,400 back in 90 days. But the contract didn't say that. The contract said the bonds would be redeemed at maturity at the company's sole discretion. Sole discretion. 4 words. Which meant, in plain English, that they would pay you back if and when they felt like it, and never if they didn't. And there was nothing on that page you could take to a judge. And third, the thing that made her hands go cold around the coffee pot. There was no number. A real municipal bond, a lawful one, carries a registration number from the state. She'd handled hundreds of them across the counter. She knew what the block looked like, where it sat, the little stamp. This contract had a space for it. And the space was blank. These weren't bonds. They were dressed up like bonds. But the state of Ohio had never seen them, and never registered them, and never blessed them. They were pieces of paper with a nice border. Verna took her pencil, and by the pie case, in a diner that smelled of coffee and apples, she made a small mark in the margin of page 9. A circle around sole discretion, a line under the blank registration space. Nobody saw her do it. Callender was laughing at something across the table. She folded Earl's glasses back into their cloth. She closed the folder and set it gently by his elbow, exactly where it had been. And she said, quietly, not to shame him, just because it was true, "This is a swindle, Mr. Callender." He looked up, still smiling. He thought she was making a joke he didn't follow. "How's that, honey?" "Page 9, she said. "Your escrow's your own company. Your redemption's at your own discretion. And these aren't registered bonds. They're not bonds at all." She said it plainly. She didn't raise her voice. She never raised her voice. For just a second, half a second, something moved behind the man's eyes. Not guilt. Calculation. He was reading her the way he read everyone, and he was deciding she was nothing. And then the smile came all the way back. "Well," he said warmly, "aren't you a careful one?" He patted the folder. "You know, my lawyers in Cincinnati went over every comma of this. But I do admire a careful woman." He left her $1 tip on a 90-cent lunch, and he winked, and he walked out into the sunshine, and that was that. Verna stood there with the pot in her hand. Marion came out from the kitchen wiping his hands on his apron. "What do you want?" he asked. "To take everybody's money," Verna said. The first one she tried to warn was Tom Pruitt. Tom was 25, and his wife Ellie was 23, and they'd been coming into the Bluebird since they were courting. They had a booth they liked, third from the door. Tom worked at the mill on the wet end. They were about to buy their first house, a little frame place on Ludlow Street, with a porch that needed paint, and they'd been saving hard, and they had it. They had almost exactly the amount, and now here was Callender telling them they could turn that amount into more before the closing even came due. Buy the house and have money left over. Tom was lit up about it. He talked about it the way young men talk about a sure thing. Verna refilled their cups on the Friday, and she said, "Careful, kind, Tom, before you put that money in with Callender. Will you let me read the contract with you? Just once, just to be sure." Tom laughed. He didn't mean it cruel. That's the thing you have to understand about Tom Pruitt. He wasn't a cruel young man. He was a scared young man who'd just been handed hope, and hope makes people mean to anybody who reaches for it. "Verna," he said, grinning, "no offense, but the man's got lawyers in Cincinnati. He's built shopping centers. You bring me my eggs. I think I'll trust the fella that drives the Lincoln." Ellie put her hand on his arm, but she was smiling too. And Verna said all right, and topped off the coffee, and walked away, and that was the first one lost. The second was Dell Ostrander, who ran the barber shop 2 doors down and had cut every man's hair in Halden Falls for 40 years. Verna went in Saturday morning, which she never did, and stood in the doorway with the little bell still ringing, and she told Dell straight, "Don't sign that thing." I read it. It's rotten on page 9. Dell was a good man and a proud one, and he had already given Callender his check. Told the truth, that stung him, and a stung man defends himself by going on offense. "You read it," he said, snipping away, not looking at her in the mirror. "In your 14 years shuffling papers up in Bergen, Verna, did you ever once build anything? Because that man's building us a future, and you're standing in my shop telling me it's a trick." A couple of the men waiting laughed behind their newspapers. "Now I always liked you," Dell said, gentler, which was worse. "But you lost your county job, and I understand that's hard, and maybe it's made you sour on anybody doing well. Go on home, now." Verna went. The little bell rang behind her. That was the second one lost. She should have stopped there. A wiser woman about people, if not about paper, would have stopped. But Verna had a blind spot, and here it is, because it matters. Verna believed that the truth, once you laid it out plain, would speak for itself. She thought all she had to do was show them page 9, and they'd see it the way she saw it. She never understood that people don't decide things with the reading part of their minds, they decide with the hoping part, and you cannot out-argue a man's hope with a pencil mark. So when the town announced the big investment supper for the following Wednesday, the night everyone would sign together, in the town hall, with a meal and a speech and the model gleaming under the lights, Verna decided she would stand up in front of all of them and read page 9 out loud. One more time. "The plain truth," said Plain, to everybody at once. She was sure it would work. She was so sure. The town hall supper was the fullest that room had been since the war ended. They set up long tables end to end, and the church ladies did a ham and scalloped potatoes, and there was a cake, and the model of New Halden sat up front on its own table like a wedding centerpiece. Callender wore a suit the color of cream to match the car. He worked the room. He remembered names. He remembered children's names. Councilman Arliss Reese sat up at the head table beside him, beaming, because Reese had been the one to invite Keystone to Halden Falls, and if this worked, Reese would be the man who saved the town, and everybody in that room could feel him already trying on the suit of it. They ate. Callender spoke. He was good, Lord. He was good. He talked about his own hometown, some place in Indiana that the highway had passed by, and how he'd watched it die, and how he'd sworn he'd spend his life making sure other towns didn't. His voice caught, just slightly, at the right moment. Grown men had wet eyes. And then he said the line that opened the floodgate. "The sign-up table's right there by the door. There's no shame in caution. But there's no reward in it either. New Halden starts tonight, with the folks in this room. Or it doesn't start at all. And that is when Verna stood up. She'd been sitting near the back with Marion. She stood, and she had the sample contract with her, the marked one. And she held it up, and she waited until the room went quiet. Which it did, slowly, with the scrape of chairs turning. Her voice was not loud. It never was. But it carried, because she made it carry, the way you learn to at a counter all day. "I'd like everyone to turn to page 9, she said, "before you sign anything. Please, just page 9. You could hear the model's little fountain pump humming in the quiet. "It says the money goes into escrow with a firm called Cornerstone Fiduciary," she read. Cornerstone Fiduciary is Mr. Callender's own company. So there's no one holding the money but him. She turned the page in her own copy, slow, so they could follow. "It says the bonds pay out at the company's sole discretion. That means they pay you if they want to. Not when it's due. If they want to." She lifted the paper a little higher, and it says right here there's a place for a state registration number. And it's empty. These aren't bonds, folks. The state's never seen them. I stood behind that county counter 14 years, and I'm telling you, I've never once. Now hold on. It was Callender. And he wasn't angry. That was the terrible thing. He was gentle. He came around the head table with his hands spread, smiling, and he looked at Verna the way you'd look at a sweet old dog that had wandered into church, and he delivered the line the town would repeat for 2 weeks. "Sweetheart," he said, "when you've closed as many deals as I have, you come find me. Until then," and here he turned to the room, and gave it a beat, a showman's beat, "you keep that coffee hot." The laughter came like a wave. It started at the head table and rolled to the back wall. 40-some people, her neighbors, laughing, and some of them not even unkindly. That was the awful part. Some of them laughing the way you laugh from relief when the frightening thing turns out to be nothing. And Councilman Reese stood and clapped Callender on the shoulder and said into the noise, "Rex, thank you for your patience with our local worrier. Verna, honey, sit down and let the man work." More laughter. Verna stood there another moment, the contract still up in her hand, Earl's glasses still on her nose, and she understood, standing there, that plain truth was not going to save these people, because they did not want to be saved from the thing they'd already decided to love. She lowered the paper. She sat back down. Marion put his big hand over hers on the table, and neither of them said anything, and up front the line to the sign-up table got longer. 40 families signed that night. $96,000 in a fiber suitcase, and the suitcase went into the Lincoln. And Callender drove it to a bank that was not in Halden Falls, and not in Ohio. The days after were the hardest of Verna's life, harder than losing the job, harder in some ways than losing Earl, because grief at least is clean, and this was not clean. This was a slow, daily thing. A town deciding, together, without ever quite saying so, to punish the woman who'd tried to spoil the party. The tips went first. Verna's booths were the ones by the window, and her regulars started taking the counter instead, or Sue's tables on the far side, so they wouldn't have to sit in her section and feel what they felt. A dime where there'd been a quarter. A keep it that wasn't there at all. She'd wipe a table after a family of 4 and find 11 cents. She never said a word about it. She carried the dishes back, and she washed her hands, and she came out again with the pot. Then it got smaller and meaner. One morning she came in early to open with Marion, and somebody had been by in the night and left a dictionary on the counter. A big one, from the library, propped open with a salt shaker. Open to the H's. And a line drawn in ink under one word, so she wouldn't miss it. Hysteria. Marion saw it before she did, and tried to sweep it into the back, but she caught his arm, and she looked at it a good while, and then she closed the book gently, and said, "It's due back Tuesday. I'll run it over." That was all. But Marion said later he'd never wanted to hit a man he couldn't see as bad as he did that morning. Here is where Verna Tillett showed you who she was. Because a smaller person breaks here, or turns bitter, or goes quiet and just takes it. Verna did none of those. Something in her shifted, in those hard gray days, from pain over to resolve. She'd tried to save them with words in a crowded room, and words in a crowded room had failed. So she stopped talking. And she started working. The first thing she did on a Sunday night after close, alone in the empty diner with one light on over the counter. Marion kept a box of the Bluebird stationery in the office, the good kind, with the little bird printed at the top, that he used for ordering supplies. Verna took 3 sheets, and in her clean county clerk hand, the hand that had written out Cora Bell's salvation 8 years before, she wrote a letter to the State of Ohio Division of Securities in Columbus. She laid it out the way she'd learned to lay things out for auditors. No emotion. Just the facts. Numbered. The name Keystone Renewal Trust. The instrument being sold as a municipal renewal bond. The amount, $2,400 a family. The count, roughly 40 families. The 3 defects on page 9, quoted exact. And a question. At the end, plain. Is this instrument registered with your office, and is Keystone Renewal Trust licensed to sell securities in the state of Ohio? She signed it with her name and, underneath, former clerk, Marl County Register of Deeds, 1955-1969. She thought that line might make them read it instead of pitching it. Then she did the second thing, and this is the thing that would matter most of all, though nobody knew it yet. She made copies. Verna did not trust that a letter mailed was a letter kept, so before she sealed the envelope, she took a fresh sheet under a carbon and wrote the whole letter out a second time. And she kept the carbon in a manila folder at home in her dresser. And she did the same with the marked-up sample contract. She'd talked Callender's young man out of a second copy at the supper, claiming she wanted to read it proper this time, and he'd handed it over with a smirk. That marked contract, page 9 circled in pencil, went in the folder too. Every scrap. She kept carbons of everything. 14 years at a records counter teaches you one thing above all others. The paper is the truth. Whoever holds the paper holds the truth. She was building a folder while the town laughed, and she told not a soul. The third thing was the quiet one and the tender one, and it's the reason this story doesn't only make you angry. Verna could not save 40 families, but she thought, maybe, she could save 1 or 2. Not with a speech. She was done with speeches. She'd do it 1 kitchen table at a time. She went to the Pruitts first. Not to say I told you so, they hadn't signed yet. They were waiting on their house closing. The money was still theirs. She went on a weeknight, after her shift, and she knocked on the door of the little rented place they were about to leave, and Ellie let her in surprised. And Verna said, "Tom, I'm not going to argue with you. I'm going to sit here and read you 1 page, and then I'll go home, and you'll do whatever you think is right." And she took out Earl's glasses, and she put the contract on their kitchen table, under the light, and she read page 9 to them slow, word for word, and she explained each part the way she'd explain a deed to a widow. What escrow means, why a man holding his own escrow is a fox guarding the henhouse, what sole discretion does to a promise, what a missing registration number means about whether the state has ever laid eyes on the thing. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. When she was done, she folded the glasses and stood up. "That's all," she said. "That's everything I know. You're a smart young man, Tom. Read it yourself twice before you sign it. Promise me you'll read page 9 twice." And Tom Pruitt, who had laughed at her in the diner, sat looking at that page in his own house with his own future on the table. And something in the boy's face was changing, though he didn't say much, and Ellie walked Verna to the door and squeezed her hand hard and didn't say anything at all. Then she did the same for old Mrs. Okafor, the widow on Cedar Street whose husband had come over from Nigeria to work the mill in the 50s and who lived alone now on his pension. Verna read her page 9 at her kitchen table too, over tea, slow, and Mrs. Okafor, who had learned the hard way in 2 countries to be careful of smiling men with beautiful cars, listened to every word and then patted Verna's hand and said, "You are a good girl. I will keep my money in the coffee can." 2 families. Verna kept a list, in her head, of the ones she meant to reach. There were a handful more who hadn't signed yet. She'd get to them, quiet, 1 table at a time, before the 90 days ran. It cost Marion. All of this. Standing by her cost him. 2 of his oldest breakfast regulars. Men who'd signed with Callender and didn't care to eat their eggs across the room from the woman calling it a swindle, took their business up to the Rexall counter and told Marion why. Marion listened to them say it, and he took off his apron, and he held the door open for them himself, and he said, "Then I guess you'd best go where the coffee's more agreeable." He lost them. He didn't lose 1 minute of sleep over it. When Verna tried to apologize for the trouble she was bringing him, Marion said the truest thing anybody said to her that whole autumn. "Verna," he said, "you're the only one in this town still doing your old job for free. I'm not about to charge you rent for the booth." And he refilled her coffee, for once, instead of the other way round. So that was where it stood, as October ran down toward November. The town had its money in a suitcase somewhere out of state. Callender had his signatures. Reese had his glory, ordering New Halden street signs before a single spade had touched the ground. And Verna Tillett had a manila folder in her dresser, and a letter somewhere on a clerk's desk in Columbus, and 2 families who might just keep their homes, and a whole town that thought she was a bitter, jealous, hysterical old woman who couldn't stand to see anybody happy. She didn't feel bitter. That's what none of them understood. Standing at the counter those mornings, watching the Lincoln shine across the street, she felt something much quieter and much harder than bitterness. She felt certain. She had read the page, she knew what the page said, and the page did not care who laughed. 90 days was 90 days. Maturity was a real date on a real calendar, and it was coming, whether the town believed in it or not, the way winter comes. Then, on the last Thursday in October, the county newspaper ran a notice on its front page, boxed and bold, with a drawing of the model beside it. Groundbreaking ceremony, New Halden Renewal Plaza, Saturday the 30th. A brass band. The mayor. A gold-painted shovel. The whole town invited to watch the future begin, and below it, in smaller type that most people skipped right past, a second line that made Verna set down her coffee pot and reach slow for Earl's glasses. Phase 2 subscriptions now open. Present bondholders invited to increase their stake. $1,000 per family. Limited time. He wasn't leaving with the $96,000. He was coming back for more. She read that second line 3 times. $1,000 per family. Limited time. Then she folded Earl's glasses back into their cloth and slid them into her apron pocket, and she did not say a word to anyone. Marion watched her from the grill. He knew that face by now. It was the face she wore when she had stopped hoping a thing would fix itself. "Verna," he said, "whatever you're about to do it after the breakfast rush." She did it before the breakfast rush. She did it the next morning, in fact, before the sun was full up. She borrowed Marion's truck. She told him she had an errand at the county seat, and that was all she told him, and Marion, who trusted her the way you trust weather signs you've watched your whole life, handed her the keys and asked no questions. The county seat was 40 miles east. Verna had driven that road 1,000 times in her clerk years. She knew every dip in it, every leaning barn, She drove it now with her hands steady at 10 and 2, and her purse on the seat beside her, and inside the purse a checkbook with almost nothing in it, and a resolve with almost everything. The courthouse smelled the way it always had: floor wax and old paper and radiator heat. She climbed the marble stairs to the second floor, and she stood for a moment outside the Register of Deeds office, at the very counter where she had worked 14 years before they cut her position to save a salary. The girl behind the counter now was maybe 23. She did not know Verna from Eve. "I'd like to see the corporate filings," Verna said. Keystone Renewal Trust, and any subsidiary. Cornerstone Fiduciary Services, that would be the one. The girl blinked. "You'll want the charter records. That's the ledger room back there." "Are you an attorney?" "No," Verna said. "I used to stand where you're standing. I know where the ledgers are." She found them herself. She pulled the charter book down from the shelf, and she carried it to the long oak table under the window. And she put on Earl's glasses, and she read. There it was, plain as a fence post. Keystone Renewal Trust. Chartered 11 weeks ago. Capital on record, $500. $500. A man had come into Halden Falls and collected $96,000 from 40 families, promising to build a shopping plaza and refinish Main Street. And the company he did it under had been alive for 11 weeks and had $500 to its name. Less than the barber had put in, less than any single family had handed over. Verna sat very still. She did not feel triumphant. She felt cold, the way you feel when you find the water in the basement is deeper than you thought. Then she did the only thing she knew how to do. She asked the girl for certified copies. She paid the fee out of her thin checkbook, $1.50, and she watched the clerk press the raised seal into each page. She slid them into a fresh manila folder. And on her way out of town she stopped at the post office and mailed them, certified, return receipt requested. To the examiner in Columbus whose name she had gotten from her first letter's reply. Harlan Voss. Ohio Division of Securities. She kept the return receipt slip. She kept everything. Then she drove the 40 miles home, and she was back at the Bluebird by the lunch rush, tying her apron, refilling cups, as if she had done nothing at all. Because in the eyes of the town, she had done nothing at all. That was the strange part. The whole machinery of it was invisible. A woman in a diner apron, a folder in a dresser drawer, a certified letter riding a mail truck east while the town painted signs for a party. And what a party they were planning. The groundbreaking. Saturday the 30th. It was all anybody could talk about now. Reese had ordered a brass band from the high school 2 towns over. The mayor had bought a gold-painted shovel, an actual shovel, sprayed gold, and he practiced with it on his own back lawn so the photograph would come out right. There were to be folding chairs. There was to be a ribbon. Del Ostrander closed the barbershop for the afternoon so he wouldn't miss it. And under it all, quiet as a tick in the wall, the Phase 2 money began to move. Families who had put in $2,400 now scraped together $1,000 more. To increase their stake. To get in deeper before the limited time ran out. Tom Pruitt did not. Mrs. Okafor did not. The Pruitts and the widow and 6 other families sat on their hands and their savings, and they said nothing, because saying nothing had become the price of not being laughed at. But the barber did. Del Ostrander wrote his $1,000 check on a Tuesday, and Verna knew the exact day it cleared, because he came into the Bluebird that Thursday crowing about it. Cleared this morning, he told the counter, to anybody who'd listen. Bank called to confirm. Money's working now. Money's building New Halden as we speak. Verna wiped the counter in front of him and said nothing. But she thought about where that money had gone to clear. Not into any account in Halden Falls. Not into any account in Ohio, most likely. It had cleared into somewhere out of state, the way the first 96,000 had, into a fiber suitcase and a cream Lincoln and a man's private discretion. She thought about the word discretion. It was such a soft word. It sounded like manners. On page 9 it meant he could keep the money and owe you nothing and be entirely within the letter of the thing you signed. Then, 4 days before the ceremony, the plan changed. It changed fast, and it changed in a way that told Verna everything. Reese announced it from the town hall steps at noon, red-faced and delighted, as if he'd been handed a gift. The groundbreaking was being moved up. 9 days early. Mr. Callender, he said, had cleared his calendar to do them the honor sooner. Why wait? Why not begin the future this very Thursday? The band could still come. The shovel was still gold. Present bondholders had until Wednesday night to increase their stake, and then Mr. Callender would break ground, and the money would be locked into the great work. Locked in. That was the phrase Recess used, thinking it meant safety. Verna set down her coffee pot when she heard it. She understood at once what had happened, though not another soul in Halden Falls did. He had been tipped. Somewhere between Columbus and here, word had traveled that a letter was circulating, that an examiner was asking questions. And Callender, who read people the way other men read the newspaper, had done the only smart thing a swindler can do when the law starts to stir. He'd moved his clock ahead of theirs. Get the phase 2000s into the suitcase before the state man ever set foot in the county. Break the ground, take the photograph, collect the last of it, and be gone. Verna stood at the counter and felt her one advantage slipping. The letter was in the mail. The examiner was a name on a return receipt. And the shovels were coming out Thursday. For the first time since she'd read page 9, she felt something close to despair. Not because she'd been wrong. Because she'd been right, and right did not seem to be fast enough. She had done everything a plain, honest person could do. She had read the page, she had pulled the filings, she had written the state. And still the man was going to stand in the town square with a gold shovel and a brass band and walk off with another handful of her neighbor's savings, and there was not one thing she could do to stop the ceremony from happening. She went home that night and took the manila folder out of the dresser. She spread it on the kitchen table under the light. The marked contract, the carbon of her letter, the certified charter showing $500, the return receipt slip. She looked at it all a long while, and then she put it back, and she folded Earl's glasses on the nightstand, and she lay awake listening to the mill sound off in the dark, slower now than it used to run. Thursday came up gray and clear and cold, groundbreaking morning. They set the folding chairs up in the empty lot at the end of Main where the plaza was to rise, the lot that had been the old cannery before it burned. They tied a red ribbon between two posts. They leaned the gold shovel against the speaker's table. The high school band shivered in their uniforms and blew warm on their fingers. Half the town came out in their good coats. Reese wore a carnation. The mayor kept checking his watch and smiling at the road that came in from the east, the road that would bring the cream Lincoln any minute now. Verna stood at the back, near the diner, in her coat over her apron, because Marion had closed the Bluebird for the morning and come out to stand beside her. He didn't have to. He did it anyway. That was Marion. 10 o'clock came. The Lincoln did not. 10:15. The band played a second number to fill the time. Reese laughed too loud and said the man was a busy man, a man of affairs, he'd be along. 10:30. And a car did come up the road from the east, but it was not a cream Lincoln. It was a plain dark sedan, and it did not shine, and out of it climbed not Rex Callender, but a heavy-set man in a bank manager's overcoat, with a briefcase. And behind him a second man, younger, in a gray suit that did not fit the occasion at all. The crowd went quiet the way a room goes quiet when the wrong person walks into a wedding. The bank manager went up to the speaker's table, He looked out at the folding chairs, at the gold shovel, at the ribbon, at the 400 hopeful eyes, and you could see it cost him something to say it. "I'm afraid there isn't going to be a groundbreaking," he said. "I'm the manager of the escrow bank. This is Mr. Voss, from the State Division of Securities. I have here a cease and desist order. As of this morning, the municipal renewal bonds sold in this county are ordered off the market. They were never registered securities. They were never anything the law recognizes." Nobody moved. The band lowered their instruments. "Where's Callender?" Somebody called out. It was the barber. His voice cracked on the name. "Mr. Callender left the state last night," the manager said. "We don't know where he is. The escrow account he set up at my bank," and here the man's voice dropped because he was ashamed of what his own bank had held. "The account is nearly empty. Between all 40-some families, there is $1,900 left in it. That is the whole of it. $1,900, where there should have been $96,000 and another handful of phase 2000s on top. $1,900. For a moment there was no sound at all in that lot but the wind and the flap of the red ribbon. Then the sound started. Verna would remember the sound the rest of her life. Not shouting. Not at first. It was a low sound, a kind of moan that went through the folding chairs as one family after another understood, as one man after another did the arithmetic on a year's savings gone. Somebody's wife sat down hard in the frozen grass. Del Ostrander put both hands flat on the speaker's table and stared at the gold shovel like it had bitten him. Verna did not move. She stood at the back with Marion, and she did not say "I told you so," because she had already told them, and telling them again would have been a cruelty, and cruelty was not in her. She just watched the man Voss take a sheet of paper out of his briefcase. And she watched him look for a place to pin it, and she recognized the sheet before he ever held it up. Because she had marked it herself, in pencil, in her own kitchen, weeks before. It was page 9. They moved the whole thing into the town hall, because the wind was too much and because the folding chairs suddenly seemed obscene out there by the empty lot. The same hall where they had laughed at her. The same room, the same long tables, the same crowd, only the faces were different now. The faces had gone white and still. Voss stood at the front where Callender had stood. He pinned the marked contract to the corkboard behind him, page 9 facing out, the pencil circle plain for anyone in the first 3 rows to see. The gold shovel leaned in the corner where somebody had carried it in out of the cold, useless now, a joke nobody would ever laugh at. "I'm going to read you the 3 things that made this illegal," Voss said. "They're all on one page. Page 9 of the contract every one of you signed." He read the first one. The escrow agent, the party who was supposed to hold your money safe and neutral, was a company called Cornerstone Fiduciary Services. And Cornerstone Fiduciary Services was wholly owned by Keystone Renewal Trust, which was owned by Rex Callender. The fox, Voss said, was guarding the henhouse. He held your money on behalf of himself. He read the second one. Redemption at maturity was at the company's sole discretion. Voss let that phrase sit in the air. That means, he said, that whether you ever saw a dime back was entirely up to him. You didn't buy a bond. You bought his permission to be paid, and he was never going to grant it. He read the third one. Nowhere on the instrument was there a state registration number. A real bond, Voss said, carries a number the state assigns after the state examines it. These carried no number because the state never saw them. Because he never intended us to. This was not a security. It was a story with a signature line. He set the page down. He looked out over the room. And then he asked the question Verna had not expected. The question that turned the whole morning. "I have to ask," he said. "Because my office got a letter. a very good letter, on diner stationery that laid out these 3 defects better than most attorneys could have. Somebody in this town read this page and understood it. Somebody warned you. Who was it? The silence that followed was a different silence than the one at the supper. That one had been a laughing silence, a silence with contempt in it. This one had shame in it, and it had weight, and Verna felt it before it turned. And then it turned. Slowly, head by head. The whole room came around, the way a field of sunflowers comes around, until every face in that hall was pointed at the back booth of nothing, at the doorway where a 58-year-old waitress stood in her coat over her apron, with her late husband's reading glasses folded in her pocket. Verna did not say anything. She did not have a speech. She had never had a speech. She had only ever had the page. She reached up, slow, and she took off her coat, because the hall was warm now with all those bodies, and she set it over her arm. And then, because she did not know what else to do with the whole town looking at her, and because it was the only thing her hands knew how to do in a room, she picked up the coffee pot that Marion had brought in from the diner and set on the front table for the statemen, and she carried it down the center aisle, and she filled Harlan Voss's cup. Steady, not a drop spilled. "Thank you," Voss said quietly, just to her. "You're welcome," Verna said. And that was the whole of what she said, in front of all of them, on the morning she was proven right. The reckoning did not come all at once. It came in pieces, over the days that followed, the way the truth of a hard winter comes in pieces, one cold morning at a time. The first piece was the deposits, and that one they understood already. Everyone who had signed had lost their $2,400. There was $1,900 to divide among 40 families, which came to less than $50 a household, and even that would be tied up for months in the state's proceeding. Reese lost his. The barber lost his, both his, the $2,400 and the Phase 2,000 on top, because he'd been so proud to get in deeper. $3,400, a barber's savings, gone into a suitcase. But the second piece was worse, and it took a few days to surface, and when it did it, went through the town like a second frost. It was the deeds. Voss found it in the Phase 2 paperwork, the increase your stake documents that the deeper in families had signed in the last 2 weeks. Buried in that paperwork, in language most of them had never read, was a second mortgage. A lien. When you upgraded your stake, you had pledged your house against it. Callender hadn't just taken their $1,000, he'd taken a claim on their homes. The families who had gone deeper now faced foreclosure. Not the state's foreclosure. Some out-of-state finance company Callender had assigned the paper to, so that even with the man himself gone, the liens were alive and owned by someone who meant to collect. Delostrander could lose the barbershop and the rooms above it where he'd lived 30 years. 2 farm families out on the county road could lose ground that had been in their names since before the war. And here was the thing. Here was the thing that made the whole town, over those cold days, finally understand what it had done to Verna Tillett. The families who had not gone deeper, the families who had not signed the Phase 2 paper, kept their homes clean. No lien. No claim. Nothing pledged. They had lost their first $2,400 like everyone else, the ones who'd signed at all. But some of them had never signed even that. The Pruitts had never signed anything. Not the first deposit, not the second. Because a waitress had sat at their kitchen table one night in October and read them page 9, twice, and made Tom read it back to her until he understood it in his own mouth. Mrs. Okafor had never signed. Because Verna had walked the widow line by line through the same page, quiet, no lecture, until the woman folded the contract shut herself and said she'd keep her money. Thank you. 6 other families, The ones Verna had reached in those bitter weeks when her tips dried up and someone left a dictionary open to the word hysteria on her counter. 6 other families had their savings and their deeds both whole, because they had listened to the woman everyone else was laughing at. That was the shape of it, when it all came clear. The ones who had mocked her hardest had lost the most. The ones who had let her read to them at their kitchen tables had lost nothing they couldn't stand to lose. Tom Pruitt came to the diner on the afternoon of that first day. He came in alone, and he did not sit at the counter. He walked back to Verna's section, to the booth people had been avoiding for a month, and he stood beside it, turning his hat in his hands, round and round, the way a young man does when he has to say a thing he'd give a year of his life not to have to say. "Mrs. Tillett," he said. "Sit down, Tom," Verna said. "You're making the sugar nervous." He sat. He put the hat on the table. He was 25, and he looked younger than that, and his ears were red, and he could not for a moment get the words to come. "I was the loudest one," he finally said, "at the supper. When you stood up, I laughed the loudest of anybody. I want you to know I know that." "I know it too," Verna said. "Not unkind. Just true." "The deed to our house is clean," Tom said. "Ellie and me. It's clean because you sat at our table and made me read that page twice. I didn't want to." "I thought you were," he stopped. He couldn't say the word he'd thought. "You thought I was a bitter old woman who couldn't stand to see anybody get ahead," Verna said. "It's all right. A lot of people thought it. You just said it louder." "We'd have signed the phase too," Tom said. "Low, we talked about it. Ellie wanted the future so bad. We'd have put the house up and we wouldn't even have known we did it. It was buried so deep in there. We'd be losing our home right now. Today, this week. Except for you." Verna looked at him a long moment. Then she reached across and put her work-hardened hand over his young one, just for a second. "You've got a home to raise babies in," she said. "That's the whole reward I wanted. Now let me get you some pie. You look like a man who hasn't eaten." Ellie came in a little after, and she didn't say much at all. She just came around the booth and put both arms around Verna's neck from behind and held on, and Verna felt the girl shaking, and she reached up and patted her arm and said, "There now. There now. You're all right. You did the smart thing." And Ellie squeezed her hand and could not speak, and that was access enough. That was the whole of it, said without a word. Reese was different. Reese never came to apologize. Reese came to explain. He caught Verna on the street 2 days later, outside the diner, and he had that same red face, but it wasn't delight anymore. It was something between panic and self-pity. "You have to understand, Verna," he said. "The paperwork looked official. It had seals on it. It had that model, the little town, everything. Any reasonable person would have believed it. I invited the man here in good faith. I did what any councilman would have done. Nobody could have known." "I knew," Verna said. "Well, you," Reese stopped, because there was no end to that sentence that didn't damn him. "You were a clerk for 14 years. You read the page. You stood up in front of the whole town and told us, and I thanked the man for tolerating our local worrier." He couldn't finish it. He stood there with his mouth open and his excuse dying in it, and Verna did not help him. She had helped a lot of people in her life. She did not owe Arliss Reese the mercy of an easy exit. She just looked at him, plain and steady, until he ran out of words entirely and walked away, and she let him go without another syllable. His excuse was his own sentence. He would carry it around this town for the rest of his life, telling anybody who'd listen that the paperwork looked official, and every time he said it. Everybody would remember the woman who'd read the paperwork and known better. The barber couldn't even manage that much. Del Ostrander, who had crowed at her counter that his money was working, that his check had cleared, that New Halden was rising as they spoke, Del could not look at her at all. He'd cross the street rather than pass the diner window. He'd lower his eyes into his coffee if she came near. He'd signed deeper than almost anyone. He was going to lose the shop. And every time he thought of it, he had to think of the morning he'd stood at her counter and laughed, and there is no worse punishment for a proud man than that. Verna never said a word to him. She didn't need to. He said it all to himself, every day, and it was enough. As for Callender, they got him 3 days later, at a state line down south in the cream Lincoln, with the fiber suitcase still in the trunk. Most of it still in the suitcase, because a man who steals a whole town's savings can only spend so fast. The sheriff, Aldous Price, brought the news into the Bluebird himself, hat in hand, half an apology in it. Because Price had been slow to move, and knew it. He'd wanted proof before he'd act against a man everyone loved. Verna had handed him the proof, and he'd sat on it. He knew that too. They picked him up this morning, Price told her. Extradition'll take a while. But they got him. They got the suitcase. Verna nodded. She was carrying a tray of plates, and she didn't set it down. That's good, she said. And that was all. No gloating. No triumph. She had never wanted the man punished so much as she'd wanted her neighbors safe, and the two were not the same thing, and she knew the difference even if the town was only now learning it. She carried the plates to table 4. The millmen ate their eggs. Outside, across the street, the empty lot, where the plaza had been going to rise, sat frozen and bare, and somebody, sometime that week, had come and taken the red ribbon down, and taken the folding chairs away, and the gold shovel had ended up nobody knew where. The little architect's model of New Halden sat in the town hall lobby another month before somebody quietly carried it out to the trash. The future they'd all cheered for went into the trash with it, and the town went back to being what it was. A slowing mill, a half-shuttered Main Street, a hard, real place that a man in a cream Lincoln had thought he could sell a dream to, and had for a little while. Spring came the way it always does to that part of Ohio, slow and wet, and then, all at once. By April the Bluebird was full again. Fuller than it had been in years, if Marion was honest, and Marion counted the receipts, and he was honest. Some of it was the ordinary business of a town going about its living. And some of it was Verna. Because the town had learned something that winter, and it did not forget it the way it had once forgotten the widow's farm she'd saved back in '63. This time it stuck. This time there was a lien and a foreclosure and a barber who lost his shop to teach it. And what the town learned was simple. When a piece of paper mattered, when there was a signature line at the bottom and a family's savings on the line, you took it down to the Bluebird first, and you asked the waitress to read it. It started small. A man came in one morning with a mortgage refinance from the bank, and he waited until the counter cleared, and he asked her, plain, if she'd mind looking it over. Verna wiped her hands on her apron, and she took Earl's glasses out of the pocket, and she read it, right there, standing at the counter, while his coffee went cold. She found nothing wrong with it. This one's honest, she told him. Sign it. And he did, and he went away easy, and he told everybody. After that it was a farm lease. After that a widow's insurance policy she didn't understand. After that a young couple's first mortgage, and Verna read them the paragraph about the adjustable rate and made the boy read it back to her. Twice, the way she'd made Tom Pruitt do, until he understood what he was signing in his own mouth. Some mornings there was a line, not for pie, for Verna. People would come in and get a cup of coffee and sit and wait their turn with a folder in their lap, and when it was their turn they'd slide into her section and lay the papers on the formica, and she'd take out her husband's glasses and she'd read. Marion put a frame behind the register. In it, behind the glass, was the contract. Callender's contract, page 9, with the pencil circle still on it, the very sheet Harlan Voss had pinned to the corkboard that morning in the town hall. Voss had let her keep it, after the state was done with the case. Marion hung it up over the coffee machine where every customer could see it. And when a stranger asked what it was, Marion would say, "That's the page my waitress read when nobody would listen to her. You want anything looked at before you sign it, she's in the back booth." The radio said Callender's trial was set for the fall. One dry line on the county station, between the weather and the grain prices. Verna heard it drying dishes and did not stop drying. Reese resigned from the council that spring, quietly, in a 2-line notice in the county paper, and nobody threw him a supper. Cora Bell came in on a warm morning in May. The same Cora Bell whose farm Verna had saved back in '63, catching the transposed parcel number that would have handed her ground to the wrong lien. Cora was old now, older than Verna. And she sat at the counter and had her coffee and watched the line of people waiting to have their papers read, and she smiled a small smile. "They remember now," Cora said. "For a while," Verna said. "Till the next fellow comes through in a nice car." "No," Cora said. "This time they'll remember. You gave them a barber's shop to remember it by." Verna didn't answer that. She just refilled Cora's cup. And then she looked up, because the bell over the door had rung, and a young man had come in with a folder under his arm and that particular look of a person about to sign the biggest thing they'd ever signed. He looked around the full diner, unsure, and then somebody at the counter pointed him toward the back booth, without even being asked. He came over and stood there a second. "Mrs. Tillett?" "They said down at the mill, they said you'd look this over. Before I sign it. It's my first house." He held the folder like it might break. Verna set down the coffee pot. The morning light was coming in the front window, gold and low the way it does in spring, and it fell across the framed contract behind the register. And it fell across the formica, and it fell across the young man's hopeful, worried face, which was not so different from Tom Pruitt's had been, or from any of theirs. "Sit down, son," Verna said. "Let me get my glasses." And she took Earl's reading glasses out of her apron pocket and unfolded them from their soft cloth and put them on, and she opened the folder to the first page, and she began, quiet and steady and certain, to read. Somewhere there's a town that took care of its own again, because one old pair of hands knew to read the small print. If you've got a Verna in your town, the one everybody underestimates until the day they can't, tell me where. Comment your city. I read every one.